Hi, Alex and Elizabeth. Seems like you guys weren't able to open the video that I sent you last week that had the answers to the fill-in on the Persian Gulf area. So I am making a new video tonight that combines the answers to the fill-in on the Persian Gulf as well as the answers to the fill-in about Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Hopefully this will help prepare you guys with everything you need for all of the tests to study for the test. So while I am thinking about it, I want to remind you of something that will possibly help you. On the first page of each chapter, or the second page of each chapter, they have these fast facts that will give you the gross domestic product, the population, the capital. Those kind of things can be very helpful to you in filling out notes, answering questions at the end of the chapters and things like that. So just to remind you of those charts, you might want to look at those because they will help you with some of these things that we're doing on Africa as well. So I'm going to read through the fill in the blank that I sent you that started with Saudi Arabia. And if you guys weren't able to open the last video, then these are some answers you will need to study for your test. As I read through it, you'll see that the answers come straight out of the word bank. Saudi Arabia is the largest Middle Eastern nation. It exports more oil than any other country in the world. It is located on the large Arabian Peninsula, which juts down into the Arabian Sea with the Persian Gulf in the east and the Red Sea in the west. The land is mostly desert, with the Rub al-Khali in the south being one of the largest sand deserts in the world. No one lives there. It is called the Empty Quarter. Most settlements are around oases, including the capital, Riyadh. The ruling dynasty was started by Ibn Saud in the early 20th century, and the family still rules. So Saudi Arabia does have a king or an emperor today. A very strict form of Islam called Wahhabism is practiced there. Christians and Jews are hated, and many human rights violations are noted, as well as the oppression of women. Women cannot vote, run for office, and they will finally be able to drive in 618. Your book said they could not drive. The book was printed before they were given the right to drive. When we think of animals in Saudi Arabia, we think of Arabian horses and camels. The nomad tent dwellers of the Saudi desert are Bedouins. There are about 1 million of these traditional sheep, camel, sheep, and goat herders. Most don't wander all year anymore. So the empty quarter, the desert that nobody lives in, the Bedouins would go through that. They would set up camps. They would move around, but they don't live there permanently. They used to live permanently wandering with their tents, but most of them now have homes somewhere and only camp out part of the year. Okay, now to the section on Iraq. A fertile plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers forms the basis for the country of Iraq. Those two rivers are very important. This nation was ruled by a ruthless dictator, Saddam Hussein, from 1979. His government, which was Sunni Muslim, was prejudiced against the Shiite Muslim majority in the country. He was killed in December 2007. Saddam had done things like invade Kuwait over oil rights. He was taken out basically by U.S. between civil war in his own country and U.S. forces attacking Iraq. Iraq has only 36 miles of coastline, with Baghdad, with 7.2 million people, is its capital. In ancient times, the city of Babylon was here. So Baghdad and Babylon are the same place. Another ancient city in Iraq is Nineveh from the Bible story of Jonah. And you know, Jonah did not want to go to Nineveh, and a whole lot of things happened, including being swallowed by the fish when he tried to run away. So that's where that story happened, was in the city of Nineveh in modern-day Iraq. One major human rights violation against the Shiites was Hussein's government draining the Mesopotamian marshes in their area of the country. The new government has been refilling the marshes. As of 2013, over half had been refilled. So Hussein was part of the Sunni Muslim group, and because he didn't like the Shiites, he went to their part of the country and began to drain the marshlands to keep them from having access to fresh water. And then the last blank, I'm looking for the name of the rock. The Behistun rock on a high cliff in Iraq has inscriptions which allow linguists to read the ancient Babylonian language. If you've ever heard of the Rosetta Stone, which was really important in allowing historians to decipher the Egyptian language, the Behistun rock is that important in Iraq for helping them to understand the Babylonian language. And when you think about the Babylonians, you think about the Bible stories of Esther and Daniel and King Nebuchadnezzar and things like that. The next fill-in was on Iran. The country of Iran, with its capital of Tehran, is one of the only Shiite Muslim majority countries. Now, Iraq would also be a Shiite Muslim majority, but it was normally governed by Sunnis. So Iran usually is a Shiite Muslim majority governed by other Shiites. The city of Susa or Shushan in Iran is the location of the Bible book of Esther. And you guys know that story. Esther saved the Jews from being annihilated with a plot created by a man named Haman. The people of Iran do not speak Arabic, but the Persian language, Farsi. Most people in this part of the world speak Arabic, but Iran is a separate language. It's not just a dialect, it's a totally different language group. Tehran is the largest city in all of the Persian Gulf with more than 12 million people. Iran has drawn concern internationally because it has a nuclear weapons program. Back when I was growing up, when I was in elementary and junior high, there was a civil war in Iran, and a very conservative Muslim government took over from the Shah, and they literally imprisoned a couple of hundred people in the U.S. Embassy in Iran and kept them there for over a year. So Iran has not got a really good human rights violation record, and it does not have a good record on getting along with other nations of the world. Okay, now, the next fill in the blank was on Israel, and I'm going to read my notes, but they're not necessarily in the order of your fill in the blank. But this will help you fill in the blanks. Israel is called the Holy Land to Jews and Christians. It was the promised land that God gave to his chosen people, the Jews, and it was conquered under Joshua. At the end of the 19th century, that would be in the 1800s, there were people called Zionists who wanted to restore Israel, and they started moving into what was then called Palestine, which is Israel today. Jewish immigrants poured into Palestine in the 1930s, and Palestine gained its independence from Britain in 1948. They revived the language of Hebrew. The immigrants came from at least 100 different nations. Because Israel is such a small country and is surrounded by Muslim countries on all sides, and there's a lot of tension and fighting over the land that Israel says belongs to them, everyone in Israel is required to serve in the military for a couple of years. I think this rule even applies to women, but I'm not sure. The capital of Israel is Jerusalem. There is a desert that runs through Israel. It is called the Negev, and it is irrigated to produce abundant fruits and vegetables. They grow a lot in the valley of the Negev. Israel was called Canaan before Joshua went in and got it and was able to win it over from the Canaanites and the other tribal groups that were there. And then it was changed to Israel. It was called Palestine from the end of the Old Testament until the end of British rule, and it is called Israel today since 1948. There is a spot in Israel called the Valley of Jezreel. It's also called the Plain of Esdraelon, and it is where people believe that the Battle of Armageddon, that is talked about in Revelation, will take place. Tel Aviv is the second largest city in Israel, and it is Israel's largest port. Israel won the Gaza Strip in the Six-Day War. In 2005, they were forced to withdraw from the Gaza Strip, and elections were held in 2007, and a group called the Hamas, which is a Muslim terrorist group, came to power. They are Sunni Muslims, and they are Islam fundamentalist. Even though there were Hebrew Jewish people living in the Gaza Strip area, it was also inhabited totally by 1.76 million people, and most of those were Sunni Muslims. The Jordan River is the longest river in Israel, and it flows into the Sea of Galilee, which is actually a large lake. And this lake is subject to really strong winds from the north. And if you remember a lot of your stories in the Bible, Jesus would be with his disciples in boats, and at times they would talk about storms coming up on the Sea of Galilee. The West Bank of the Jordan was captured from the country of Jordan in the 6 Days War as well. 2.1 million Arabs lived in the West Bank, and 500,000 Jewish settlers lived there. So you can understand that the West Bank would be an area where the Palestinians and the Jews would be fighting for territory. When I use the term Palestinian, I'm talking about people who live in the area of Israel. They are not Arab in background. In fact, if you trace their family history, they are actually descendants of Esau, as in the story of Esau and Jacob in the Bible. But because Esau did not receive the blessing, he separated from his family, and they went off and they worshiped other gods, and it eventually led to them becoming Muslim. In Judaism, the religion of Judaism, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and when that happened, they quit performing the yearly sacrifices where they killed a ram or a bull and where they set a goat free on the Day of Atonement that was supposed to carry all the people's sins. And the rabbis have discouraged messianic movements and competitions with Christianity. The Jews are still waiting for their Messiah to come. They did not think Jesus was the Messiah. They thought their Messiah would come in and he would be a ruler, a government ruler, and deliver them from Rome. And I'm sure that today the Jews that are waiting think that the Messiah is going to come in and unite all of the Jews all over the world and make Israel a great nation again, like it was during the time of David. The Jewish people, of course, only used the Old Testament, and the Talmud and the Mishnah. The Talmud would be your first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And the Mishnah is the Pharisees' interpretations of the law. And the Gemara is traditions about applying the law. So in other words, they read the Old Testament, but they also have these other books that explain what the Old Testament is supposed to mean. The Torah, which was the law that God gave Moses, identifies obedience. The obedience to the law is part of being a good Jew. in Judaism, people think they have to work hard to overcome their sin. They, especially since the sacrifices have died out, they basically think that the only way they can get to heaven is by being a good person and by good works. Because the Messiah hasn't come yet, they don't really have the hope of salvation. They do believe that they can overcome sin with God's help and that God's going to raise all the people from the dead and reward the just. There's three types of Jews. The Orthodox are the strictest people that follow the law. These would be people that you would see all the time. The men would have the little skull caps on, and the women, when they're married, wear scarves and cover their hair. Conservative is in the middle, and then Reform. The temple where we have co-op is a Reform temple. Some of those people don't even practice all the dietary laws, which means that some of them would think it was okay to eat pork, but not all. The Dead Sea is another feature of the land in Israel. It has the lowest shoreline and the saltiest water in the world, and there's not an outlet. So since nothing flows into it or out of it, the salt just gets, when the water evaporates out of the lake, it just gets saltier and saltier. There is an oasis in a place called En Gedi in the desert hills, and that place is a really beautiful place to visit and all of that. People think that the Bible cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were at the southern part of the Dead Sea. And there are places there where there are salt deposits, which would correspond to the pillars of salt. Lot's wife looked back and turned into a pillar of salt. There is a place in Israel called Masada, which is where the Jewish zealots made their last stand against Rome in the early part of the time after Jesus died and rose again, the early ADs. So the Palestinians are the people from Palestine, like I told you, and in the beginning of the 20th century, they began to call the Arabs in Israel the Palestinians, and the Jews are the Israelis. There have been 4 wars between Israel and the Arab nations. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the scripture. The Dead Sea Scrolls are some very famous 900 manuscripts with fragments and scrolls which contain every Bible book except Esther and Nehemiah. They are older than the oldest known copy of the Masoretic text, and these scrolls were actually found in some caves up in the hills around the Dead Sea. A shepherd boy threw a rock into an opening in the cave and heard it hit a vase or a piece of pottery, and when he went to look, he found these scrolls. Okay, let's go on to the country of Syria. Syria was formerly under French control. Its capital is Damascus. People in Syria speak Arabic. The country claims to be a republic, but it's actually ruled by Hafez al-Assad. In 1970, he took over, and when he stepped down, his son Bashir al-Assad came in 2000. There's been a civil war in Syria since 2011, and the weird thing is, even though Bashir al-Assad's government is a dictatorship, we support his government because the people fighting against him are extremist Muslim groups, so it's like you choose the best of the worst. Okay, the next country after Syria is Jordan. Jordan is the size of the United States state of Indiana. Jordan is one of the only countries in the area of the Bible lands that doesn't have any petroleum deposits. More Palestinians live in Jordan than Jordanians because so many Palestinians have left because of fighting in Lebanon and Israel. So there's a lot of refugees in Jordan. Jordan has a very peaceful and stable government. It is a constitutional monarchy was ruled by King Hussein, and when he died, and he's not related to the Hussein from Iraq. But when he died, his son Abdullah II took over. They have a lot of resources in Jordan: bromine, potash, salt from the Dead Sea, but only 3% of their land in Jordan can be farmed. So they make their money through selling mineral rights and things like that. King Hussein, the father, who was the ruler that I first knew about in Jordan, actually married an American girl who gave up her whole life here in the States and went and became his queen. Lebanon was also a former French possession. Lebanon separated from the country of Syria in 1920. Tyre and Sidon, major twin cities mentioned in the Bible. Tyre was a Phoenician capital. They were famous. The cities of Tyre and Sidon and the country of Lebanon were famous for the cedar trees. In the story in the Bible about Solomon building the temple, he got cedar trees from the forest of Lebanon. Beirut is the capital. 59% of Lebanon is Muslim and 32% is Christian. You've got a lot of Orthodox Christians in Lebanon. There have been civil wars in Lebanon, often on from 1975 to 1990. They have a very diverse government. The way they solved their problems with Christians and Muslims fighting each other is they divided the number of seats in the legislature between Christians and Muslims. The president must always be a Christian. The prime minister must always be a Sunni Muslim. And the parliamentary speaker must always be a Shiite Muslim. So they're trying to get all three groups to work together, but the country is still very unstable. So that ought to help you guys get ready for your test. This week, your assignments included making a chart on Africa. I gave you everything except the capitals, which you can find on those fast facts pages on that first chapter about Africa, which is, excuse me, the chapter is chapter 19, Southern and Eastern Africa. You're going to be making a chart about that. Notice that I am not having you do the chart on every country in Africa. And so that means that only the ones that are on the chart will be the ones I'll be requiring you to learn. Next week when we talk about chapter 20, same thing. We'll add more countries to our chart from Central and Western Africa. One of the things I want you to notice is how low the standard of living is in all of these countries. I also want you to notice how unstable the governments are, how young most of these countries are, because most of them were colonized by European countries. And so as you go through, be thinking about some of those things. Obviously, you can read, and I want you to read the whole chapter. I just don't want you to freak out over the number of countries, because I'm not going to ask you to learn every single chapter, every single country in all three of these African chapters. This week, you're also receiving 4 maps, but because Africa is divided into zones, the maps are also divided. So, excuse me. Excuse me. I sneezed. So that means you'll have one map for South Africa, one map for, excuse me, Central Africa, etc., etc. So the maps are actually very small and very short. So hopefully these things, I'm sorry, will help you guys as you try to work with these chapters on Africa, and will help you get ready for your test on the Middle East. Have a good night, and please let me know you get this video.